If there is a second escort with less than 6 sorties, this combat is fought against this escort. If the second escort also fails, and the attacking unit still has less than 6 sorties, the attacking unit may choose to attack the enemy unit that was being escorted. If there is no second escort with less than 6 sorties, this combat is fought against the enemy unit that was being escorted. Escorted unit air naval combat example. A French convoy with no sorties is tracing a supply line for a French ground unit. The convoy is being escorted by a UK carrier with 2 sorties. As it traces a supply line, it is intercepted by an Italian fighter with no sorties. First, the Italian fighter, the attacker, and the UK carrier, the escort, resolve a combat using the combat resolution sequence. The French convoy is ignored. The result is DR+2. The Italian fighter adds 1 sortie, bringing its total to 1, and UK carrier adds 2 sorties, bringing its total to 4. In addition, the effect was escort failed. Because the escort failed, the Italian fighter may now attack the French convoy. The UK carrier is ignored. This combat result is DD+3. The Italian fighter adds 1 sortie, bringing its total to 2. And the French convoy adds 3 sorties, bringing its total to 3. In addition, the effect was interdiction successful. The supply line trace failed, and the activation of all involved units ends. If an escorting unit receives an escort failed result, it is not impacted in any other way than the sorties it incurs. For example, if it has less than 6 sorties, it still provides escort in future interceptions. 5.2.3 Air Naval Combat DM Special Cases Weather. If a combat occurs in a specific hex, use the respective combat DM based on the weather affecting that hex. If the combat occurs in a sea zone, and is not in a specific hex, use the respective combat DM based on the weather affecting the majority of the water hexes in that sea zone. Example, the Western faction is performing an amphibious invasion in the Mediterranean. The weather for the warm zone is poor. The weather in the desert zone is fair, which it always is. When the naval movement path trace goes into sea zone 24, the Western faction declares Benghazi as the invasion hex. The Axis faction then declares it is intercepting with an Italian warship in the sea zone, though it could have chosen to intercept in Benghazi instead. Since that combat is being fought in the sea zone, and the majority of water hexes in sea zone 24 are in the warm zone, the poor weather-related DM is used. The warship failed to interdict the invasion, so the Axis faction now declares it will intercept the invasion in Benghazi with a nearby German fighter. Since this combat is being fought in the invasion hex, and it is located in the desert zone, the fair weather-related DM is used. 5.3 Ground combat. Remember, use is an abstract simulation. An army may fight many times, and not be reduced in strength. That does not mean it suffered no losses. It did, but not at a level that was significant enough to reduce combat effectiveness at the game scale. A ground combat is fought between ground units. It occurs in the operations phase when the phasing faction initiates a mobile attack. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx15. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. Or initiates a designated assault attack. The combat is fought using the combat resolution sequence 5.1. An assault attack is a set-piece attack that may involve multiple armies attempting to capture a main objective or put a hole in a defensive line. A mobile attack represents an army operating relatively independently and in response to enemy resistance. So which one should you use? A single unit with a positive combat DM, for example, a German panzer unit in fair weather has a +4 DM, is more successful with mobile attacks because it can move and fight multiple times in a single activation. Just one army can attack multiple enemy units and or capture several cities. With no positive combat DM, for example, a USSR infantry army, extra armies in an assault provide a positive combat DM. In addition, some event markers only provide a combat DM if it is an assault. The disadvantage of an assault is that a unit attacks only one time. So it only affects one enemy unit and hex. 5.3.1 Ground combat prohibitions. A unit cannot designate an assault attack and conduct a mobile attack in the same phase. It's one or the other. A unit cannot conduct a mobile attack against an enemy ground unit occupying a fort. A unit can only assault it. A unit cannot conduct a mobile attack against an enemy ground unit in a hex affected by poor or severe weather. A unit can only assault it. A unit in a map box cannot attack unless it is performing an amphibious invasion, a 6.3.2. Note: a unit that exits a map box during its activation can attack, as it is no longer in the map box. 5.3.2 Mobile attack. If a mobile attack is initiated during a unit's ground movement, it is immediately resolved. After resolving the combat, if the attacker's activation has not ended, it may continue moving and initiate more mobile attacks, even against the same enemy unit. Remember to pay all the movement costs for each mobile attack, a 4.2.3.3. A mobile attack against a unit defending in a hex already designated as the target of an assault attack receives no benefit from, nor gives any benefit to, any assault against that hex. 5.3.3 Assault attack. An assault attack is designated during a ground unit's movement by placing one assault marker on the phasing unit and pointing the assault marker's arrow at the defending unit. Remember to pay all the movement costs to designate the assault. 4.2.3.3. Placing the assault marker on a phasing unit ends that unit's activation. Therefore, it cannot continue moving and attacking that phase. A phasing faction may initiate and resolve a designated assault at any point during its operations phase. Exceptions: an assault cannot be resolved during a unit's activation. Example, the USSR 11 Guards unit moves 2 hexes and enters a German infantry unit's EZOC. The Soviet faction cannot stop the 11 Guards unit's move to resolve a designated assault somewhere else on the map, and then continue to move 11 Guards again. An assault due to an amphibious invasion must be resolved at the time of the invasion. After an assault is resolved, remove the assault markers from the attackers involved in that combat. All assaults do not have to be resolved at the same time. Example, the Soviet faction has 8 units marked to assault several hexes. After resolving an assault involving 3 of those units, it activates an air unit. It then later resolves another assault. No matter how many assault markers are pointing to the same hex, an assault can only have up to 3 attacking units in a single combat resolution. This restriction is to put a limit on DM, and represents the difficulty of battlefield coordination. Other units may resolve their own separate assault against that hex. The phasing faction decides how many and which units are involved in each assault. A designated assault attack does not have to be initiated and resolved. The phasing faction may choose not to initiate an assault. Combat. At the end of the phasing faction's operations phase, remove any remaining assault markers on the map. An assault can be resolved against an enemy ground unit that was not in the hex at the time the assault was designated. Because an assault may be resolved after it was designated, the unit intended to be attacked may not be there due to other combats against it, and a different enemy unit may have retreated into the hex. An assault can be resolved against a hex that no longer contains an enemy ground unit. No combat is fought, but the phasing faction may use advance after combat 5.3.7 to move one of the attackers into the hex. After it is done, remove the associated assault markers. 5.3.4 Ground Combat DM Special Cases Air Naval Support. An air or naval unit's sorties or supply state does not affect the value of this DM. Assault attack. For an assault, the attacker's DM is based on the unit that is declared the primary attacker. Each other attacking unit involved in the assault only applies an additional attacker DM as listed on the Ground Combat DM list. Example, 1 USSR full-strength tank and 2 USSR reduced-strength infantry units marked with assault markers attack a German infantry unit in fair weather. The USSR infantry units are across a river, but the tank unit is not. The Soviet faction declares the tank unit as the primary attacker and the 2 infantry units as additional attackers. The Soviet combat DM is +4 or +2 for a tank unit in fair weather and +1 for each additional attacker infantry unit. The -1 DM for attacking across a river does not apply because the tank unit, the primary attacker, is not attacking across the river. Also, even though the USSR infantry units are reduced, the -2 DM for being a reduced unit does not apply because neither unit is the primary attacker. Event markers. An event marker 14.0 may be committed to a combat if the defending unit or any involved attacking unit allows the marker to be played. Example, German, Italian, and Finnish infantry units resolve an assault against a USSR infantry unit in Leningrad. The German unit is the primary attacker. The Axis faction could commit a German heavy arty marker, the Italian tanks marker, and the Axis ground support marker, because of the Finnish unit. 16 Unconditional surrender to any edition use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Isolated. A defending unit is considered isolated if it has no eligible hex it can retreat into a 5.3.5, and it is not adjacent to a friendly, city, fort, or ground unit. Exception. A defending unit occupying a fort on an island is not considered isolated. Nearby support alleviates the we're surrounded feeling, even if there is nowhere to run to. An event marker, for example, naval evacuation, cannot be used by the defender to avoid being isolated. An adjacent city, fort, or ground unit cannot be used by the defender to avoid being isolated if the hexside between it and the defender is a ground movement prohibited hexside. Example, a USA ground unit in hex 4329 attacks a German ground unit in hex 4330. The German unit cannot use the adjacent city of Taranto to avoid being isolated because the hexside between the German unit and Taranto is a water hexside. A defender with no adjacent support that is in a city or occupying a fort to except on an island as above can be considered isolated. Amphibious Invasion Assault. If an assault is fought in a coastal hex as part of an amphibious invasion 6.3.2 and an escorting warship unit, or surface action marker with less than 6 sorties is in the invading force, the attacker applies the naval support DM. The defending hex does not have to be the invaded hex. Example, a German infantry is in Cherbourg, and another is in hex 3111. A USA ground unit invades hex 3010. If it attacks the German unit in Cherbourg, the Western faction can apply the naval support DM. If it attacks the German unit in 3111, it cannot apply the naval support DM since it is not a coastal hex. 5.3.5 Retreat. A combat result may state the defending ground unit must retreat. A retreat is a 1 hex move in total. This movement cannot be intercepted, nor is the unit considered activated because of it. A unit that retreats moves 1 hex away from the attacker, and it must put a 1 hex gap between the attacker and defender. Exceptions. A 1 hex gap is not required for the following. The only attacking ground unit is performing an amphibious invasion assault. The hex retreated into, and the attacker's hex share a ground movement prohibited hexside. Example, a UK ground unit in Catania attacks an Italian ground unit in hex 4528. The Italian unit can retreat into Hex 4529 due the water hexide between Hex 4529 and Catania. The defending faction chooses the hex a unit retreats into. In an assault, the retreat is away from any one of the attacking units. The defending faction chooses which unit it is moving away from. It cannot choose an attacking unit that would prevent the defending unit from retreating due to Retreat Prohibitions 5.3.5.1. If a retreat path is available, the defender must retreat. Unless otherwise prohibited, a unit can retreat into a hex containing an enemy, air or naval unit, causing it to move a 4.2.3.7. An airdrop or partisan's marker does not affect retreats into or out of its hex. Also, that marker stays in its hex. A USSR unit can retreat from a USSR hex on the east map edge into the central Russia box. A full-strength unit occupying a fort is not required to retreat. However, if it chooses to retreat, retreat rules apply to it. A unit may retreat into a hex containing a fort, but cannot occupy that fort. This simulates the offensive or defensive posture of the army for the month. If you want to hold a fort, occupy it first. Having an adjacent fort, like having an adjacent city, provides some benefit, as it guarantees a retreat location, if the hex has no ground unit in it, and prevents the defender from being isolated. 5.3.5.1 Retreat Prohibitions. A unit cannot retreat into an enemy, city or fort. A unit cannot retreat into a hex containing an east unless it contains a friendly, city or fort, and the unit is also putting a 1 hex gap between it and the attacker. The retreat cannot violate ground movement prohibitions or stacking limits. 5.3.5.2 cannot retreat if a reduced unit cannot retreat, eliminate it. If a full-strength unit cannot retreat, or chooses not to retreat because it is occupying a fort, leave it in its hex and flip it over to its reduced side. 5.3.6 Unit Elimination. A ground unit may be eliminated in combat due to the combat result or because it cannot retreat. Put an eliminated unit in its faction card's eliminated box, and check the player aid sheet's national will effects table to see if its country loses national will. Example, a USSR Guards unit is eliminated while defending in combat. The Soviet faction puts it in its faction card's eliminated box, and reduces USSR national will by 1. If a defender is eliminated in a mobile attack, put a no ease marker in the defender's hex. All no ease markers placed are removed at the end of the moving unit's activation. Therefore, only the currently activated unit can take advantage of the negated EOC. 5.3.7 Advance. After combat, if a defending unit is eliminated or retreats out of its hex, the attacking unit may choose to enter the defender's hex at that time. If it was an assault, only one of the attacking units can advance for attacker's choice. There is no movement cost to advance after combat. The cost was paid when the attack was initiated. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx 17. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. If a unit does not advance after combat, it may continue moving provided it performed a mobile attack and has movement points remaining. If it's in an EZOC, see EZOC Restrictions 4.2.3.1. If a unit does advance after combat, the advancing unit ignores all EZOC as it enters the defender's hex. After it is in that hex, it may continue moving provided it performed a mobile attack and has movement points remaining. If it's in an EZOC, see EZOC Restrictions 4.2.3.1. If the attacker enters a hex containing an enemy, air or naval unit, the enemy unit is moved as per Air Naval Displacement 4.2.3.7. If the attacker enters a hex containing an airdrop or partisans, that marker stays in the hex. 5.4 Strategic Combat. Strategic combat is fought between factions in the strategic warfare phase in 9.2.1. The combat is fought using the combat resolution sequence of 5.1. A unit can provide a strategic combat DM regardless of its supply state to 7.1, or the number of sorties it has. A strategic combat result involves moving the Germany, UK, or USSR FAC lost marker on its on-map factory count track. 6.0 Actions. An action allows a unit in a hex or map box to move and or fight. It may also put an airdrop or partisan's marker in a hex. Unless stated otherwise, each action is declared and resolved before another action is declared. Example, the Axis faction declares and resolves one airstrike before declaring another. Actions listed below may be performed in any order. However, certain procedures within them may have a strict order. Example, the Axis faction activates an air unit to perform an airstrike action against an enemy air unit. It then activates a ground unit for a ground action. This is followed by an airdrop action to place an airdrop marker, and then by another airstrike action. Unless stated otherwise, one unit's action must be completed before another unit is activated. Example, the Axis faction cannot stop moving a ground unit in the middle of its ground action, activate an air unit to perform an air rebase action, and then continue moving that same ground unit. Action Special Notes. A unit marked with a strategic move marker cannot be activated. At some point during the phase, a conditional event of 13.0 may occur during a unit's action. If that happens, immediately check that event's rules. 6.1 Special Marker Action Important. Unlike other event markers of 14.0, an airdrop, partisans, or surprise attack marker cannot be placed during a unit's activation, nor can it be committed in Step 3 of an air, naval, or ground combat. Exception, a partisan's marker can be committed in Step 3 of a strategic combat. Example, the Axis faction cannot move a ground unit, initiate a mobile attack with it, place an airdrop marker, resolve that attack, and then continue moving that same ground unit. At any point during its action subphase except as noted above, the phasing faction may take an airdrop 14.1, partisans 14.10, or surprise attack marker 14.17 from its faction cards events box, and use it as per its rules. Example, after the Axis faction activated and completed the actions of 3 ground units within France, but before it activates its next unit, it puts the German airdrop marker in Paris. It then activates its next unit. Only one of each marker may be placed in the same hex. For each marker's placement, effects, and removal rules, see its specific entry in the event markers of 14.0 section. 6.2 Air actions. Only an air unit can be activated to perform an air action. Air actions are Air Rebase 6.2.1, Air Strike 6.2.2, Air Support 6.2.3, Air Escort 6.2.4, Air Interception 6.2.5, and Bombing Run 6.2.6. Important, an air unit with 6 sorties cannot be activated. Check a unit's sorties each time you want to activate it. Note that air naval displacement 4.2.3.7 does not involve activation. The air or naval unit must move, even if it has 6 sorties. Activating an air unit does not cost production points. Activating an air unit does not add sorties to its total. However, performing the action will add sorties as indicated in each action rule. So do not add 1 sortie for activating the unit, and then add more sorties based on what it did. Just follow the specific rule. More than 1 air unit can be activated in a phase. An air unit can perform only 1 action per activation. An air unit can be activated multiple times in a phase. An air unit can perform the same action multiple times in a phase. 6.2.1 Air Rebase. A phasing air unit can activate to move 4.2.2. This move cannot be intercepted. When the movement is done, the unit's activation ends. Sorties. When the air unit's activation ends, add 1 sortie to its total. 6.2.2 Air Strike. A phasing fighter or bomber unit in a hex can activate to attack an enemy air or naval unit within a 7 hex range of the phasing air unit. An air strike's purpose is to inflict sorties on an enemy unit. This is a way the phasing faction can attempt to suppress enemy air or naval units before it starts land operations. The 7 hex range allows striking at enemy air units far behind front lines. If limited to 5 hexes the range for air support, an enemy air unit that was 6 hexes behind its lines would be immune to attack, but still able to provide air support to its ground units. The phasing faction declares the enemy unit to be attacked and traces an air movement path from activated air unit to the defender. There is no physical movement of the air unit's counter, it stays in its hex. This path cannot be intercepted. To resolve the airstrike, conduct an air-naval combat of 5.2. When the combat is done, the phasing unit's activation ends. Sorties. When the air unit's activation ends, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 6.2.2.1 Airstrike. Special notes. An enemy unit can be the target of more than 1 airstrike in a phase. 18 Unconditional surrender to any edition use 2 rulebook SV 31 August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. A phasing unit can perform more than 1 airstrike against the same enemy unit. Each airstrike requires a separate activation. 6.2.3 Air Support. During a ground combat, a phasing or non-phasing faction may activate one of its fighter or bomber units within a 5 hex range of the defending unit to attempt to provide air support to the combat. Air support is a DM on the ground combat DM list. The air unit must be in a hex and of the same nationality as the defending unit or one of the attacking ground units. The owning faction declares the unit it is using and traces an air movement path to the defending hex. There is no physical movement of the air unit's counter, it stays in its hex. If only one side commits an air unit, that side automatically receives air support, and the air unit's activation ends. If both sides commit an air unit, immediately conduct an air-naval combat. The ground combat attacker is also the air combat attacker. The final result of the air-naval combat will determine if either or both sides receive air support for the ground combat. When the air-naval combat is done, each air unit's activation ends. Sorties. When the air unit's activation ends, if it did not fight a combat, add 1 sortie to its total. If it did fight, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 6.2.4 Air Escort. A phasing fighter unit can activate to escort a naval unit as it performs an amphibious invasion, naval rebase, naval transport, or a supply line trace in a sea zone. A non-phasing fighter unit can activate to escort a naval unit if it is attacked by an airstrike or carrier strike. A fighter cannot escort a bomber in use for several reasons. First, a bomber unit is a representation of bombers and fighters. Second, testing showed that it was very rarely used by players, and so it was removed to reduce rules length. The owning faction activates a fighter to escort a naval unit when the naval unit is initially activated to perform an action or when it is attacked by an airstrike or carrier strike. If a warship unit is also eligible to provide escort, the faction must state at this time if it will also escort. Example, a UK fighter and convoy are in Malta. An Axis air unit initiates an airstrike against the convoy. The Western faction declares the UK air unit is escorting. To provide escort, the fighter must be stacked with the naval unit at the time that unit is initially activated or attacked. While escorting, there is no physical movement of the fighter's counter, it stays in its hex. The escort provided by the fighter ends when the fighter is no longer in air escort range 6.2.4.2, or when the escorted unit's activation ends. When the provided escort ends, the fighter's activation ends. Sorties, when the fighter's activation ends, if it did not fight a combat, add 1 sortie to its total. If it did fight, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 6.2.4.1 Air Escort Prohibitions. A fighter cannot escort another escorting unit. A convoy could simultaneously have 1 air escort and 1 naval escort. A fighter using naval transport cannot escort. Planes being shipped in freighters don't fly. 6.2.4.2 Air escort range of fighter escorts a naval unit in the hex or sea zone that the fighter is located. If escorting naval movement, the fighter does not move with the naval unit, it only escorts the naval unit within its sea zone. Land-based air escort range is limited. Example, a UK fighter and convoy are in Malta. The UK fighter can provide escort in Malta, and within sea zone 22. 6.2.5 Air interception intercepting a phasing unit may result in the interdiction of its action, i.e., prevent the completion of the action it is performing. Note that interception is automatic, but interdiction is not. A non-phasing fighter unit can activate to intercept, and attempt to interdict a phasing air or naval unit as it performs a bombing run, Naval Rebase, Naval Transport, Amphibious Invasion, or a supply line trace in a sea zone. The interception must be within Air Interception range 6.2.5.2. To intercept, the non-phasing faction must be able to trace an air movement path from the fighter to where the interception is occurring. There is no physical movement of air unit's counter, it stays in its hex. This path cannot be intercepted. There is no interception of an interception. A non-phasing faction declares interception immediately after the phasing faction has traced a bombing run path into a hex, has moved or traced a path into a sea zone, or has declared an amphibious invasion hex. A non-phasing faction must be given the opportunity to do this before the phasing unit continues. To resolve the interception, conduct an aired naval combat of 5.2. The non-phasing unit is the attacker. The final result of the aired naval combat will determine if the interdiction was successful. When the combat is done, the non-phasing unit's activation ends. Sorties, when the non-phasing unit's activation ends, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 6.2.5.1 Air interception prohibitions a fighter cannot intercept strategic movement, a supply line traced within a hex, air naval displacement, air rebase, air strike, air support, carrier strike, air or naval escort, or air or naval interception. 6.2.5.2 Air interception range a fighter in a hex can intercept a bombing run if a hex of the bomber's movement path trace is within a 5 hex range of the fighter unit. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx19. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. Example, a UK bomber unit in Hull tentatively traces a path from hex 2411 directly east to Hamburg in 2422. An Axis fighter unit in Antwerp could intercept the bombing run. To avoid this, the bomber traces a path outside of the fighter's interception range. A fighter in a coastal hex or in any port of a sea zone can intercept a naval rebase, naval transport, amphibious invasion or supply line trace if the naval movement or naval movement path traced is in the same sea zone as the air unit. In this situation, interception takes place in the sea zone, not in a hex. Exception, amphibious invasion hex, see below. Example, an air unit in Antwerp could intercept naval movement in sea zone 10 and 11. A fighter in any hex can intercept a movement path trace into an amphibious invasion hex if the air unit is within a 5 hex range of the invaded hex. This is independent of intercepting in the sea zone, which is also allowed. Example, an air unit in Paris could intercept the invasion hex of Cherbourg. 6.2.5.3 Air interception special notes within the same hex or sea zone, more than one interception can be made against the same phasing unit. Exception, during an amphibious invasion, only one interception per sea zone or invasion hex is allowed. 6.3.2.6. Each interception is resolved separately, and must be done by a different non-phasing unit. The non-phasing faction must resolve one interception before declaring another. When a phasing unit moves into or traces a movement path into a different hex or sea zone, it may be intercepted again, even by a unit that did so earlier in a different hex or sea zone. A non-phasing unit can make more than one interception in a phase. However, within a single hex or sea zone, it cannot intercept the same phasing unit more than one time during that unit's action. Example, in the same phase, a German fighter in Antwerp could intercept a UK convoy moving in sea zone 10, and then again in sea zone 11. It cannot intercept the convoy twice in either sea zone. If later in the phase a different UK convoy moved through sea zones 10 and 11, the German fighter could also intercept it once in each sea zone. If both allied factions want to intercept the Axis faction at the same time, the Western faction resolves all its interceptions first. 6.2.6 Bombing run a phasing bomber unit can activate to bomb an enemy factory in Germany that is within a 20 hex range of the bomber. The phasing faction declares the hex to be bombed and traces an air movement path no more than 20 hexes to it. There is no physical movement of the bomber unit, it stays in its hex. This path can be intercepted by a non-phasing fighter unit. 6.2.5. If the bombing run was not interdicted, put a bombed marker in. the declared hex. If it was interdicted, no bombed marker is placed. In either case, the bomber's activation ends. Only one bombed marker may be placed in a factory hex. No more than 8 bombed markers can be placed in one turn. A bomber can make more than one bombing run in a phase. Sorties, when the bomber's activation ends, if it did not fight a combat, add 1 sortie to its total. If it did fight, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 6.3 Ground actions. Only a ground unit can be activated to perform a ground action. Ground actions are Army Operations 6.3.1 and Amphibious Invasion are 6.3.2. To activate a ground unit regardless of its strength, its country must spend its production points. This cost is paid one time at the start of the ground unit's activation. A leg unit costs 1 production point to activate. A mobile unit costs 2 production points to activate. A ground unit can activate only one time in a phase. Tip: when a unit's activation ends, use some method such as rotating it or putting a small item on it, like a bead, to remind you it cannot be activated again that turn. More than one ground unit can be activated in a phase, but not at the same time. 6.3.1 Army Operations. A phasing ground unit can be activated to move 4.2.3. During movement it may initiate a mobile attack of 5.3.2, or designate an assault attack of 5.3.3. 6.3.2 Amphibious Invasion. This rule is long, but do not let that scare you. There is also an extensive example at the end. You may want to set it up on the map, and walk through it to get a better feel for the rule. A phasing ground unit stacked with a convoy can activate to invade a coastal hex that contains, or is adjacent to, a friendly or enemy port within amphibious invasion range. 6.3.2.2. A friendly port can be invaded. It is a way to get more troops there quickly. In addition, the invaded hex must be in a sea zone containing a friendly surprise attack marker, and if the invaded hex has no port, at least one adjacent port must also be in that same sea zone. 20 Unconditional Surrender 2 Any edition Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. A surprise attack marker has a country specification, but any friendly unit may use it. The country denotes who can buy the marker in the mobilization phase. The invaded hex can contain an enemy unit or EZOC. After the phasing faction activates the ground unit, it activates the convoy and any escort, so those units need to have less than 6 sorties. It then declares it is performing an amphibious invasion. It does not, however, declare the invasion hex at this time. This is so the non-phasing faction must choose to intercept while the invasion force is tracing a naval movement path, but without knowing the final destination. It then traces a naval movement path from the activated units to the sea zone containing the invasion hex. There is no physical movement of the counters, they remain in their hex. When the path has entered the sea zone containing the invasion hex, the phasing player declares that hex. After all interceptions against the activated units are resolved, if the amphibious invasion is not aborted as 6.3.2.3, see Amphibious Invasion Resolution as 6.3.2.4. 6.3.2.1 Amphibious Invasion Prohibitions. The invasion hex cannot contain a friendly ground unit. The invasion hex cannot be affected by severe weather. The weather in the sea zone does not matter, only what is in the hex. A coastal hex without a port cannot be invaded if that coastal hex, and each port hex it is adjacent to share a ground movement prohibited hexide. Example, a UK unit cannot invade hex 4330 because it and Taranto, the only port adjacent to 4330, share a water hexide. A phasing faction cannot declare the same hex more than once per action subphase. A naval unit cannot be involved in more than one amphibious invasion per operations phase. The path trace to the invasion hex cannot cross a strait unless at least one of the strait's hexes contains a friendly, city, fort, or unit, and neither of its hexes contains an enemy, city, fort, or unit. An invading unit starting in a strait hex ignores that strait, because it does not have to cross it. 6.3.2.2 Amphibious Invasion Range. The Axis or Soviet factions can invade a hex in the sea zone containing the activated units. The Western faction can invade a hex within 2 sea zones of the activated units, i.e., the sea zone they occupy, or an adjacent zone. A Western unit in a map box can invade a hex in an adjacent sea zone. Example, a UK unit in the Arabian Sea box can invade a hex in sea zones 31 or 32. 6.3.2.3 Amphibious Invasion aborted. An amphibious invasion is aborted, and the activation of the phasing units performing it ends, if either of the following occurs. The amphibious invasion is successfully interdicted. If any amphibious invasion escort unit suffers a DR, DD, or D result in combat, the phasing faction may immediately abort the invasion. If it does this, no combat is fought between the convoy unit and the intercepting unit. The phasing units of an aborted amphibious invasion remain in the hex they activated in. 6.3.2.4 Amphibious Invasion Resolution. If an amphibious invasion is not aborted, do the following. If there is no enemy ground unit in the invasion hex, put the phasing ground unit in that hex. If the invading ground unit is not in an EZOC, it may move into an adjacent hex, and its activation ends. This move cannot violate ground movement prohibitions or stacking limits. If the invading ground unit is in an EZOC, it must either end its activation or immediately resolve an assault against an enemy ground unit in an adjacent hex. After the combat, its activation ends. If there is an enemy ground unit in the invasion hex, it must immediately resolve an assault against that unit. Note the invading ground unit is still in its original hex at this point, so it is not exerting an easy into or around the defending hex. If the assault does not clear the hex of the defender, and the invading ground unit survives, its activation ends. Since it has not moved yet, it stays in its current hex. If the assault clears the hex of the defending ground unit, the phasing ground unit must be put in the defending hex, even if it attacked with other units, and its activation ends. Mulberry, if the marker is included in scenario setup, immediately after an invading UK or USA ground unit's activation ends, if it is in a coastal hex with no port, the Western faction may put the Mulberry marker of 15.16 in that hex. Naval Units, after the invading ground unit's activation ends, and any Mulberry placement, the phasing faction must either leave all invading naval units in their current hex or put them in a port taken by the invading ground unit, or hex containing a just placed Mulberry marker. The naval units must all end in the same location. After doing this, the naval unit's activation ends. Sorties, when a naval unit's activation ends, if it did not fight an air-to-naval combat during its action, add 1 sortie to its total. If it did fight, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 6.3.2.5 Amphibious Invasion Limitations. If invading a hex without a port, that hex and an adjacent port hex must share a hexide that can be crossed using ground movement. A phasing faction may make one amphibious invasion attempt per surprise attack marker located within a sea zone. 6.3.2.6 Amphibious Invasion Special Notes. In each sea zone the movement path is traced, a non-phasing faction may intercept only one time with an air unit as 6.2.5 and or one time with a naval unit as 6.4.3. The interceptions of an amphibious invasion are limited, because they are trying to stop a specific operation within a limited time frame, and while surprised. Unconditional Surrender 2nd Edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx21. Copyright symbol 2014-2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. When the invasion hex has been declared, interception can occur in its sea zone, or in the invasion hex and non-phasing faction's choice, with each interception. These are still limited as above. That is, you can intercept with one air unit in the sea zone or hex, and with one naval unit in the sea zone or hex. It is not one air and naval unit in the sea zone, and then another air and naval unit in the hex. That's 2 interceptions in total between both places. An amphibious invasion assault may be combined with other units marked to assault the invaded hex. The invading ground unit is the primary attacker. This can only occur if the other units were marked to assault the hex before the invasion was performed. Amphibious invasion example, a German fighter is in Taranto, and another is in Palermo. An Italian fighter, surface warship, and infantry are in Catania. A UK tank unit, convoy, and surface warship are in Tunis. Also, a UK infantry unit, convoy, and carrier warship are in Malta. The Axis air and naval units have a high number of sorties on them. The exact number is not important, but the UK units have none. The Western faction places the UK surprise attack marker in Sea Zone 22, which is within 2 sea zones of Tunis. It then activates the tank, convoy, and surface units in Tunis, and declares it is attempting an amphibious invasion. It does not state the invasion hex at this time. The Western faction first traces a naval movement path into Sea Zone 19. At this point the Axis faction declares an interception, with the German fighter in Palermo, as it is within Sea Zone 19. If the UK surface unit escort fails, the Western faction could abandon the invasion at that time in order to avoid having to fight with its convoy, or it could continue, at which point the convoy would fight. The German fighter and UK surface warship escort fighter combat using the combat resolution sequence. The UK escort was successful, ending the air interception. The Axis faction then intercepts in Sea Zone 19, with the Italian surface warship from 2 sea zones away, in Sea Zone 22. Note the UK carrier in Malta cannot intercept the Italian surface warship, as it traces through Sea Zone 22, or 19, because interception of another unit performing interception is not allowed. The UK escort is successful again against the Italian warship. Since no more interceptions can occur in Sea Zone 19, the Western faction continues its movement path trace into Sea Zone 22, and declares it is invading Hex 4528 adjacent to the port of Catania. It must declare the invasion hex before any interceptions are attempted. Now the Axis faction can choose to intercept in Sea Zone 22, and or in the invasion hex 4528. In Sea Zone 22, the Axis can use the Italian fighter or surface warship units or the German fighter in Palermo. The German fighter in Taranto cannot intercept in Sea Zone 22, because it is in a different sea zone. In Hex 4528, it can intercept with the Italian warship or any of the German or Italian fighter units, as all are within 5 hexes of 4528. However, because this is an amphibious invasion attempt, the Axis faction is limited to 1 air interception and 1 naval interception within a sea zone, including the invaded hex. Therefore, despite having 3 air units available, only one of them can intercept. The Axis faction chooses to intercept first in the sea zone using the Italian warship. It fails, and so the Axis faction intercepts in Hex 4528 with a German fighter. The UK escort fails this time, and the Western faction does not abandon the invasion. So the German fighter attacks again, hitting the UK convoy. However, the German 22 Unconditional Surrender 2 Any Edition Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Fighter fails to interdict the convoy so the amphibious invasion lands. The troops hit the beaches. Since the invaded hex does not contain an enemy ground unit, the Western faction takes the UK tank unit out of Tunis and puts it into hex 4528. Because it is now in the easy of the Italian infantry unit in Catania, the Western faction must choose to either end the tank unit's activation or attack the Italian ground unit. The UK tank unit attacks and gets a DR result. The Italian infantry unit retreats into hex 4728, and the UK tank unit advances into Catania. This causes the Italian fighter and surface units to move out of Catania, as per Air Naval Displacement 4.2.3.7. The UK tank unit's activation ends. The Western faction finishes the amphibious invasion by taking the UK convoy and surface units out of Tunis and putting them in Catania, at the port just taken in the invasion, and ending their activation. The Western faction could have chosen to leave the naval units in Tunis instead. However, without a Western convoy unit in Sicily, the UK tank unit would not be able to trace supply in the upcoming supply check subphase. If the Western faction decided not to put the invading naval units in Catania, then later in the phase, the Western faction could move a different convoy unit there. However, it would be subject to interception on the way, and possibly not make it. If the Western faction wanted, and had another surprise attack marker available to put in Sea Zone 22, the UK units in Malta could activate a now or later in the action's subphase, to conduct their own amphibious invasion in Sea Zone 22. If it chose to do so, hex 4528 could not be invaded, because the same hex cannot be directly invaded twice within the same action's subphase. It also could not invade Catania, because it contains a friendly unit. 6.4 Naval Actions. Only a naval unit can be activated to perform a naval action. Naval actions are Naval Rebase as 6.4.1, Naval Escort as 6.4.2. Naval Interception as 6.4.3, Naval Transport as 6.4.4, and Carrier Strike as 6.4.5. Important, a naval unit with 6 sorties cannot be activated. Check a unit's sorties each time you want to activate it. Exception, a warship with 6 sorties can activate to trace its own supply line. Note that Air Naval Displacement 4.2.3.7 does not involve activation. The air or naval unit must move, even if it has 6 sorties. Activating a naval unit does not cost production points. Activating a naval unit does not add sorties to its total. However, performing the action will add sorties as indicated in each action rule. So do not add 1 sortie for activating the unit, and then add more sorties based on what it did. More than 1 naval unit can be activated in a phase. A naval unit can perform only 1 action per activation. A naval unit can be activated more than 1 time in a phase. A naval unit can perform the same action more than 1 time in a phase. Exception, Amphibious Invasion as 6.3.2. 6.4.1 Naval Rebase. A phasing naval unit can be activated to move 4.2.4. This move can be intercepted as 6.2.5 and 6.4.3. When the movement is done, or if it was successfully interdicted, the unit's activation ends. Sorties, when the naval unit's activation ends, if it did not fight a combat, add 1 sortie to its total. If it did fight, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 6.4.2 Naval Escort. A phasing warship unit can activate to escort a convoy unit as it performs an amphibious invasion, naval rebase, naval transport, or a supply line trace in a sea zone. A non-phasing warship unit can activate to escort a convoy unit if it is attacked by an airstrike or carrier strike. The owning faction activates a warship to escort a convoy unit when the convoy unit is initially activated to perform an action or when it is attacked by an airstrike or carrier strike. If an air unit is also eligible to provide escort, the faction must state at this time if it will also escort. Example, an Italian warship unit and convoy are in Taranto. The Axis player activates the convoy unit to move to Benghazi. Before the convoy unit moves, the Axis player declares the warship is escorting. To provide escort, the warship must be stacked with the convoy at the time the convoy is initially activated or attacked. In addition, if it is escorting a convoy's naval rebase or naval transport, the warship must be able to end its movement in the same hex as the convoy. Unlike an escorting air unit, an escorting warship moves along with the convoy. The escort provided by the warship ends when the convoy's activation ends. When the provided escort ends, the warship's activation ends. Sorties, when the warship's activation ends, if it did not fight a combat, add 1 sortie to its total. If it did fight, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 6.4.2.1 Naval Escort Prohibitions. A warship unit cannot escort another escorting unit. A convoy can simultaneously have 1 air and 1 naval escort. 6.4.2.2 Naval Escort Range. A warship escorts a convoy in the hex the warship is located, and in all locations the convoy unit moves or traces a supply line. If the convoy is performing naval rebase or naval transport, the warship must move with the convoy and end stacked with it. 6.4.3 Naval Interception. Intercepting a phasing unit may result in the interdiction of its action, i.e., ends the intercepted unit's action. Note that interception is automatic, but interdiction is not automatic. A non-phasing warship unit can activate to intercept and attempt to interdict a phasing naval unit as it performs a naval rebase, naval transport, amphibious invasion, or a supply line trace in a sea zone. The interception must be within Naval Interception Range 6.4.3.2. To intercept, the non-phasing faction traces a naval movement path from the warship to where the interception is occurring. There is no physical movement of the warship's counter, it stays in its location. This path cannot be intercepted. There is no interception of an interception. A non-phasing faction declares interception immediately after the phasing faction has moved or traced a path into a sea zone, or has declared an amphibious invasion hex. A non-phasing faction must be given the opportunity to do this before the phasing unit continues. To resolve the interception, conduct an air-naval combat of 5.2. The non-phasing unit is the attacker. The final result of the air-naval Unconditional Surrender 2nd Edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx23. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. Combat will determine if the interdiction was successful. When the combat is done, the non-phasing unit's activation ends. Sorties, when the non-phasing unit's activation ends, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 6.4.3.1 Naval Interception Prohibitions. A warship cannot intercept strategic movement, a supply line traced within a hex, air naval displacement, air rebase, air strike, air support, bombing run, carrier strike, air or naval escort, or air or naval interception. The naval movement path traced by an intercepting warship cannot go through a canal or cross a strait. An intercepting unit in a hex with a strait pointing to it ignores that strait because the unit does not have to cross it. Example, a UK surface warship in Malta cannot intercept in Sea Zone 21. A UK surface warship in Gibraltar can intercept in Sea Zone 16 or 17. 6.4.3.2 Naval Interception Range. A warship can intercept within 2 sea zones of its current location, i.e., the sea zone it occupies, and a sea zone adjacent to it. Example, a UK surface unit in Malta, a Sea Zone 22, can intercept in Sea Zones 19, 22, or 24. It cannot intercept in Sea Zone 21, because naval interception cannot trace across a strait. A warship in the North Atlantic or Central Russia box can intercept in an adjacent sea zone. Example, a USA carrier unit in the North Atlantic box can intercept in Sea Zone 7. In the above situations, interception takes place in the sea zone, not in a hex. Exception, Amphibious Invasion Hex, see below. A warship can intercept a movement path trace into an amphibious invasion hex, if that hex is in a sea zone within the ranges listed above. This is independent of intercepting in the sea zone, which is also allowed. 6.4.3.3 Naval Interception Special Notes. Within the same hex or sea zone, more than one interception can be made against the same phasing unit. Exception, during an amphibious invasion, only one interception per sea zone or invasion hex is allowed. 6.3.2.6. Each interception is resolved separately, and must be done by a different non-phasing unit. The non-phasing faction must resolve one interception before declaring another. When a phasing unit moves into or traces a movement path into a different hex or sea zone, it may be intercepted again, even by a unit that did so earlier in a different hex or sea zone. A non-phasing unit can make more than one interception in a phase. However, within the same hex or sea zone, it cannot intercept the same phasing unit more than one time during that unit's action. Example, in the same phase, a UK carrier in Malta could intercept an Italian warship moving in Sea Zone 22, and then again in Sea Zone 24. It cannot intercept the warship twice in either sea zone. If later in the phase an Italian convoy traced a supply line path in Sea Zones 22 and 24, the UK warship could also intercept it once in each sea zone. If both allied factions want to intercept the Axis faction at the same time, the Western faction resolves all its interceptions first. 6.4.4 Naval Transport. If a phasing air or ground unit that activates to move is stacked with a convoy unit, that convoy can also activate to transport that air or ground unit across sea zones, and or map boxes. 4.2.4. The air or ground unit's nationality does not matter, only that it is friendly. The air or ground unit must begin its activation stacked with the convoy. Within the same activation, an air or ground unit cannot combine other movement with naval transport. A convoy can transport only one unit at a time. Therefore, a stacked air and ground unit need to be transported separately. As the convoy is moving, it can be intercepted as 6.2.5 and 6.4.3. When the convoy enters a sea zone, the convoy and escort and transported unit may be placed in a friendly port within that sea zone to drop off the transported unit in that hex. That hex cannot already contain a convoy unit or warship if there is a naval escort with the group, or the same type of unit being transported. When placed in its destination hex, the transported unit's activation ends. Remember, a transported ground unit cannot activate again in that phase. Also, a transported air unit adds one sortie to its total unless the air unit added sorties due to a successful interdiction of the naval transport. After the transported unit is placed, the convoy and escort can continue moving or end its movement in the port with the transported unit. A convoy and escort must end movement in the same port. Sorties, when the convoys and escorts activation ends, if it did not fight a combat, add one sortie to its total. If it did fight, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. Example, this illustrates naval transport and shows how air and naval forces can activate and move multiple times in a single action subphase. It is a way for them to quickly get to a front. They do so, however, with reduced effectiveness due to the sorties they incur. It is the Western faction's actions subphase, and it wants to move a UK air unit in Plymouth to Alexandria. A USA convoy is in Cardiff, and a UK warship is in Plymouth. Because Gibraltar was taken by Axis forces, Western units cannot move through it straight to go across the Mediterranean. Instead, they must go the long way around Africa. First, the USA convoy is activated to perform the Naval Rebase action to move through Sea Zones 9 and 7 to Plymouth. It then ends its activation, adding one sortie to its total. It cannot pick the UK air unit during its activation, because Naval Transport requires the 24 unconditional surrender to any edition tilde use 2 rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Air or ground unit begin its activation already stacked with the convoy. In other words, first the air or ground unit activates, then the convoy activates. The Western faction then activates the air unit to perform the air rebase action. As the air unit begins its activation stacked with the convoy, the USA convoy activates to perform naval transport. In addition, the UK warship is activated to perform naval escort. All 3 units then move from Plymouth into Sea Zone 7, into the North Atlantic Ocean map box, into the South Atlantic Ocean map box, and then into the Western Indian Ocean map box. This costs 10 naval movement points so their activation ends, and all 3 units each add 1 sortie to their total. The convoy now has 2 sorties. If the Western faction was moving a ground unit, it could not move that ground unit again, because a ground unit can only activate once per action subphase. However, since it is an air unit with less than 6 sorties, the Western faction activates it again. Units in a map box can be considered stacked, so the convoy and warship are also activated. All 3 then move into the Arabian Sea map box, into Sea Zone 31, into Suez, through the Suez Canal, into Port Said, into Sea Zone 26, and into Alexandria. This costs 7 naval movement points. Remember, moving into and out of ports does not cost movement points. The air unit is now in Alexandria, its activation ends, and it adds 1 sortie to bring its total to 2. The naval units still have 3 movement points left. The Western faction then moves them into Sea Zone 26, into Port Said, through the Suez Canal, and finally into Suez. Their activation ends and each add 1 sortie. The warship has 2 and the convoy has 3. Since the air and naval units still have less than 6 sorties, they could activate again this action's subphase. 6.4.5 Carrier Striker carrier unit can activate to attack an enemy air or naval unit in a port or coastal hex that is in a sea zone containing a friendly surprise attack marker. A carrier strike's purpose is to inflict sorties on an enemy unit. The phasing faction declares the unit to be attacked and traces a naval movement path of any length from its carrier unit to the defender. There is no physical movement of the carrier unit, it stays in its hex. This path cannot be intercepted. To resolve the carrier strike, conduct an air-naval combat of 5.2. When the combat is done, the carrier's activation ends. Sorties. When the carrier's activation ends, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. 7.0 Supply. The supply status of a unit affects its movement and combat capabilities. Without supply, a unit will eventually be eliminated. A unit is either considered supplied or unsupplied based on its supply state. 7.1. When a unit's supply status matters for a rule, it will include one of the following terms. Supplied. A unit is supplied if it has a full or low supply state. Unsupplied. A unit is unsupplied if it has a no supply state. 7.1 Supply state. There are 3 supply states: full, low, and no. When the supply state of a unit is determined for the turn, it maintains that state until the next turn supply check. A unit with a full supply state is not marked with a supply counter. If it has a low or no supply state, it is marked with the respective low supply or no supply counter. 7.1.1 Low supply, no supply effects. A unit with low supply has a combat -2 DM applied to it. A player aid sheet, combat DM lists. A unit with low or no supply has reduced movement points, i.e. 4 for leg units and 5 for all other units. A player aid sheet, movement. A unit with low or no supply cannot be improved in the replacements phase. At 8.1. A unit with no supply cannot perform strategic movement. A 4.1. A unit with no supply is reduced in the no supply phase. 7.5.1. A unit with no supply cannot satisfy a home defense policy. 10.3.1. A unit with no supply may be voluntarily eliminated in the no supply phase. 7.5.2. A unit with no supply has its modified combat die roll result divided by 2. Round up a player aid sheet, combat DM lists. This applies to the attacker in an assault if at least one of its attacking units has no supply. 7.2 Supply check. In the supply check subphase, the phasing faction determines the supply state for each friendly unit in a hex by tracing a supply line. 7.4 to a friendly supply source. 7.3. Exception: the following units are always considered to have traced a supply line to an unlimited supply source. These exceptions speed gameplay by reducing the number of traces. A convoy unit. A unit in a map box. A UK garrison ground unit in Gibraltar. A garrison ground unit in a port on an island. The phasing faction chooses the order in which units are checked, and the supply line path traced for each unit. A unit can make more than one supply check in a supply check subphase to see if it can trace a supply line. A supply check is not mandatory. The phasing faction may choose not to supply any of its units, even if in a supply source location or otherwise exempt. Exception: a unit satisfying a country's home defense policy must make as many supply checks as it can to supply it with full or low supply. If a unit traces a supply line to an unlimited supply source, it has a full supply state. Remove any low supply or no supply marker on the unit, even it was placed earlier in the same turn. If a unit traces a supply line to a limited supply source, it has a low supply state. Place a low supply marker on the unit, even if a no supply marker was placed earlier in the same turn. If a unit cannot trace a supply line, has its supply line trace successfully interdicted, or its faction chose not to supply it, that unit's supply state is immediately reduced as follows. If it has no low supply or no supply marker on it, put a low supply marker on it. If it has a low supply marker on it, flip it to its no supply side. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx25. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. If it has a no supply marker on it, leave the marker on it. Important, a unit's supply state can only be reduced one time per turn, regardless of how many failed traces were made to supply it. Example, an Axis supply line trace across Sea Zone 22 is interdicted, causing the German Afrika Army to go to low supply. When another supply trace in the same phase is also interdicted, it is not marked with no supply. It keeps low supply. 7.3 Supply source. There are two types of supply sources, limited and unlimited. A limited supply source can supply up to 2 units, giving each a low supply state. Remember, limited equals low. An unlimited supply source can supply any number of units, giving each a full supply state. 7.3.1 Limited supply source. Each of the following is a limited supply source, LSS. A friendly overseas area factory is an LSS for its country's units. Example, a friendly Tripoli is an LSS for 2 Italian units. A friendly capital in a conquered country is an LSS for that controlling factions units. Example, Norway is a conquered western country, and Oslo has an Axis control marker in it. Oslo is an LSS for 2 Axis units. A friendly capital in an Axis country is an LSS for a German unit. Exception, Berlin is a USS for a German unit. Example, Romania is an Axis country, and Bucharest is Axis friendly. Bucharest is an LSS for 2 German units. A friendly capital in a western country is an LSS for a UK or USA unit. Exception, London is a USS for a UK or USA unit. A friendly capital in a Soviet country is an LSS for a USSR unit. Exception, Moscow is a USS for a USSR unit. 7.3.2 Unlimited supply source. Each of the following is an unlimited supply source, a USS. A friendly country's mainland area city is a USS for that country's units. The Eastern North America box or Western Indian Ocean box is a USS for a UK unit. The Eastern North America box or a friendly UK mainland area city is a USS for a USA unit. The Central Russia box is a USS for a USSR unit. 7.4 Supply line. A land supply line. 7.4.2 starts at checking unit's location, and then goes overland to a friendly supply source for that unit. A sea supply line. 7.4.3 starts at the checking unit's location, goes overland to a convoy, and then that convoy traces across a sea zone or map box toward a supply source. Remember this when contemplating overseas operations. Each unit traces its own supply line. More than one unit can use the same path to trace a supply line. All hexes, sea zones, or map boxes that are traced out of, into, or through are considered part of the supply line. A convoy unit is required and activated each time a unit traces a supply line across a sea zone or map box. The same convoy can be activated multiple times in a supply check subphase. 1. Convoy activated multiple times will accumulate 6 sorties quickly, and then won't be able to activate again for other actions. Exception, a warship unit, even with 6 sorties, may activate to trace its own supply line across a sea zone or map box without using a convoy. If a warship uses a convoy to trace a supply line, the warship is not activated. This represents inherent convoys assigned to support the fleet. Because a warship can trace its own supply line regardless of its sorties, it will eventually be supplied no matter how many times its supply line is intercepted. So the issue isn't if the warship unit will be supplied, but how many sorties it incurs to get that supply. 7.4.1 Supply line prohibitions. A supply line trace cannot include a hex containing an enemy, city, fort, unit, or service. A supply line trace cannot violate movement prohibitions. Exception, ignore all ESOC in a hex containing a friendly, city, fort, or ground unit. 7.4.2 Land supply line. From the checking unit, trace a ground movement path up to 2 hexes to a hex containing a transport line or friendly supply source for that unit. If the hexes traced into did not contain a friendly supply source, continue tracing the path along a connected transport line back to a friendly supply source. So the first hex of a supply line does not require a contiguous transport line, but the rest do. A land supply line trace cannot be intercepted. Land supply line example, a German ground unit is in hex 2434. It can trace a supply line into hex 2335, and then into Königsberg, which is a German unlimited supply source. Alternatively, it can trace into hex 2535, and then 2634, which contains a transport line. From 2634, it can then trace along a contiguous transport line back to any friendly city in Germany. It cannot trace into hex 2535, 2534, and then 2633 because the second hex does not have a transport line. 7.4.3c supply line from the checking unit. Trace a ground movement path up to 2 hexes to a hex containing a transport line or a port that has a friendly convoy unit with less than 6 sorties in it. Exception: a warship unit tracing its own supply line without using a convoy cannot trace an overland path to a different port. It must begin to trace the naval movement path part of a sea supply line from the port it occupies, see below. If the hexes traced into did not contain a port that has a friendly convoy with less than 6 sorties, or if the tracing faction has a different convoy it wishes to use, continue tracing the path along a connected transport line back to a port that does have a convoy. When the trace reaches the port, the convoy and any escort is activated. The convoy then traces a naval movement path of any length to a friendly map box or a sea zone containing a different friendly port. This port must either be a supply source for the checking unit or have a connected transport line that goes back to 26 Unconditional Surrender 2 Any Edition Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 V03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. A supply source for the checking unit. There is no physical movement of the convoy, and escort bit stays in its hex. The naval movement path part of a sea supply line can be intercepted. The path traced across land hexes cannot be intercepted. If the trace is successfully interdicted, the checking unit can try again, even using the same convoy assuming it has less than 6 sorties, and or the same naval movement path. If the second port traced into is a supply source for the checking unit, a supply line has been traced. If the second port traced into is not a supply source for the checking unit, continue tracing the path along the connected transport line back to a friendly supply source. When a supply line has been traced to a supply source, or if the trace was successfully interdicted, the convoy and escort the unit's activation ends. Sorties: when the convoys and escorts activation ends, if it did not fight a combat, add 1 sortie to its total. If it did fight, no sorties are added to its total. It already added sorties due to the combat. Exception: a warship that traced its own supply line and did not fight a combat does not add 1 sortie. See supply line example. Tripoli contains the Italian 5 ground unit, and the 2 fleet and 2 convoy units, each with 5 sorties. Benghazi contains the German Africa ground unit, and the Italian 1 fleet and 1 convoy units, each with 3 sorties. The 1 fleet is also at low supply. Hex 5436 contains the Italian 10 ground unit. Catania contains the Italian 1 air unit with 5 sorties. Against these forces is the UK Force H carrier unit with 4 sorties in Malta. The Axis faction notes the Italian convoys do not have to trace a supply line for themselves, because a convoy always has a full supply state. The Italian air unit is in a mainland Italian city, an unlimited supply source for any number of Italian units, so it traces to its own hex to remain at a full supply state. The Axis faction then checks the Italian 5 unit in Tripoli. It is in the hex with 2 convoy, which has less than 6 sorties, so the convoy is activated, as is 2 fleet to escort it. The faction then traces a naval movement path, without physically moving any counters, across Sea Zone 22. The Western faction declines to intercept with Force H. Since Sea Zone 22 contains the port and Italian unlimited supply source of Catania, the supply line is successfully traced, and the Italian 5 unit remains at full supply. For tracing supply and escorting, 2 convoy and 2 fleet each add 1 sortie, bringing each to 6 sorties. Next, the Axis faction checks the German Africa unit in Benghazi. It is in the hex with 1 convoy, so the convoy and 1 fleet to escort are activated. It then traces a path across Sea Zone 24. This time the Western faction intercepts with Force H. First, an air-naval combat is fought between Force H as the attacker, and the escort, 1 fleet. The combat result is DR+2, so the escort failed. Force H adds 1 sortie, bringing it to 5 sorties. 1 fleet adds 2 sorties, bringing it to 5 sorties. The Western faction decides to continue with the interception, and fights another combat between Force H and 1 convoy. Once again, the result is DR+2, so the interdiction was successful. Force H adds 1 sortie, bringing it to 6 sorties. 1 convoy adds 2 sorties, bringing it to 5 sorties. In addition, a low supply marker is put on the Africa unit. Unconditional Surrender 2nd Edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 V03.docx 27. Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. Because a unit may make more than 1 supply check in a supply check subphase, the Africa unit is checked for again. 1 convoy in Benghazi still has less than 6 sorties, so it activates again. 1 fleet is not activated to escort because Force H has 6 sorties, so it cannot intercept anymore. A path is traced across Sea Zone 24 to the Taranto port. Taranto is an Italian supply source, not a German one, so the supply line trace continues along the transport line from Taranto to Munich, a German unlimited supply source. 1 convoy adds 1 sortie, bringing it to 6 sorties, and the low supply marker is removed off Africa. It now has full supply. If that second supply line check had failed for some reason, the low supply marker would not flip to no supply, because a unit's supply state can only be reduced 1 time per turn. The Axis now checks the Italian 10 ground unit. Both Italian convoy units have 6 sorties, so neither can be used to trace a supply line. Instead, it traces a supply line 2 hexes from 5436 to 5434, which contains a transport line. It continues tracing along the transport line to Tripoli. Tripoli is a factory in an Italy overseas area, so it is a limited supply source for up to 2 Italian units. A low supply marker is placed on Italian 10.